Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our JCU webinar series. I'm Associate Professor Kerry Russo, and I'll be your MC for this evening. I have the pleasure of working with Dr. Anthony Marinac at JCU, and like you, I too am looking forward to his presentation. But first, we'd like to acknowledge country. I acknowledge the Australian, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of this land and pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders, past and present, of the land on which we stand today. In the spirit of reconciliation, I also acknowledge the valuable contribution that Australian, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to make to JCU and the broader community. And now for some housekeeping. So before we start, we would ask you that if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel, and I will address these with Anthony at the end of the presentation. So let me introduce our presenter. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Anthony Marinac. Anthony is a lecturer in the law school here at JCU. He is a partner in the law firm Pacific Maritime Lawyers, and he is passionate about innovative teaching. He also operates Australia's largest legal education YouTube channel with nearly 20,000 subscribers from all around the world. The videos on the channel have had 1.5 million views. Anthony is the lead author of a textbook with Cambridge University Press, and there is another in the early stages of development. Having said that, Anthony still does not claim to be an expert. In his view, teaching is evolving so quickly that anyone who settles into the belief that they are an expert is already obsolete. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Anthony Marinac. Anthony.
Thanks very much, Kerry. I vaguely recognise that introduction as sounding something like me. Well, me professionally anyway. But who am I really? I was born in 1973. The first album that I ever bought with my own money was John Farnham's Whispering Jack. As a teenager, I lived in Brisbane. I had an Expo season pass. And when Nirvana's classic song Smells Like Teen Spirit came on in the clubs, I even managed to convince myself that I could dance. I loved The Breakfast Club, the Dead Poets Society, Good Will Hunting. I was peak Gen X. Think about those movies though. The Breakfast Club was mostly set in the school library of Shermer High in 1984. Look at it. It has books. It has a card catalogue. There's not a computer in sight. There are microfiche readers. Remember those? When I think of a school library, instinctively, that's what I still have in mind. Flick over to Good Will Hunting. Now, the movie doesn't say precisely when it was set, but it was released in 1997, and it seems to have been set in a time contemporary to then. We see the insides of two classrooms, one at the prestigious MIT and one in a local college. At MIT, the class is an advanced mathematics class. Have a look. No computers, no smartboard, not even in an advanced mathematics class in a prestigious STEM university. There's a projector on the roof, but we also see two old-fashioned OHPs ready for action. None of the students have laptops. None of the students have phones. Let's go finally to the Dead Poets Society, 1989, but set in 1959. The classrooms that we see in 1959 are barely distinguishable from those set half a century later. The students in Dead Poets Society could plausibly have walked down the hall into the library from the Breakfast Club, and when they graduated, they would have gone to university in a classroom that looked like the ones in Good Will Hunting. We can go back further. This is a classroom in 1900. Other than the fashion, look at those collars, other than the fashion, it's indistinguishable from the type of classroom that we see in Goodwill Hunting a century later. And yet from 1997 until now, everything has changed. Students from 1900 or those from Dead Poets or the Breakfast Club would be utterly bewildered if they entered a classroom with a smart board out the front, a laptop on each desk, each student with a phone, talking about the fact that the crappy Wi-Fi today is making it hard to get their work down from the cloud. The older students wouldn't even understand the words. Everything has changed. To be effective educators, we must change with it. Now, some educators think that they did that, especially when COVID hit, but all they really did was put a bunch of PDFs online, stick a screen between themselves and their students, and then leave the recordings online. Not much of the teaching was actually innovative at all. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to be speaking in generational terms. That can be problematic. The boundaries of the generations are often indistinct, and within generations, people have different experiences due to location, socioeconomics, race, gender, personal aptitude, 1,000 other factors. But it does still make sense to suggest that cohorts who developed at particular points in history were subject to the same macro level changes, and that this is likely to have had some type of impact. I make no greater claims than that. Who then is Generation Z? For my purposes, Gen Z was born between about the turn of the century, maybe a little earlier, and about the global financial crisis of 2008, maybe a little later. So let's say 1996 to 2012. Some people call them Zoomers. I avoid that because it rhymes with boomers, and I don't actually think there are that many similarities between the baby boomer generation and Generation Z. So I'll stick with Gen Z. Students who've come straight from high school to university this year were born around 2003 or 2004. We are therefore right in the middle of the Gen Z transition to university. Who is this generation? Well, for many of us older folks, this was a signal moment in our lives. I don't need to describe what you're seeing. The destruction of the Twin Towers, the start of a 20-year war. Nobody in Gen Z has personal memories of 9/11. Most of Gen Z were born after it. They have never known a world without widespread internet in most homes. Most of them cannot really remember dial-up internet. In fact, when I rehearsed this presentation with some of my Gen Z students, some of them stopped me to ask what dial-up internet actually was. The pre-internet era might as well be medieval times. The leap in smartphone use in Australia happened between 2008, at which time about 20% of people had one, and 2009, at which time 50% of people owned one. So a student starting university this year was 5 or 6 when smartphones took off. They barely remember a time before smartphones, if they can remember such a time at all. When I think of a phone, instinctively, this is what I think of. And so I think this is pretty damn cool. But for Gen Z, this is a phone. This is what a phone has always been. Anything before a smartphone might as well have been a telegraph or a carrier pigeon. Facebook exploded in Australia towards the end of 2007 or early 2008. At that time, we were all quite innocent about the potential downsides of social media. And so people routinely ignored the age 13 requirement. What this means is that students starting university this year may have had Facebook accounts for as long as they can remember. They have literally never known a classroom without smartboards and personal laptops. I have personally seen a Gen Z student confronted with a whiteboard go looking for the remote with which to operate it. I don't say that to mock, but to show how incredibly different their life has been. They live in a world where celebrities are accessible. I lived in a world where I once got the autograph of the footballer Alan Izard, that's him on the screen, and I thought that was pretty cool. Where do these Gen Z folks live? Well, let me ask you a question. What do the following celebrities have in common? Kylie Jenner, Khloe Kardashian, Rihanna, Taylor Swift, Katy Perry, Drake, Justin Timberlake, Mila Kunis, Justin Bieber, Jason Derulo, Selena Gomez, and Miley Cyrus. Give up? They've all attended high school proms with fans who got on their social media and just asked them. It's a bit better than getting Alan Izard's autograph, even though I still love the Bombers. The point is that for Generation Z, everyone is accessible. They open their Facebook stream and they see something that their mum liked, followed by their friend's latest selfie, followed by the latest post from their favourite celebrity. As a result, they're not great with hierarchy. Deference is not their thing. Star power still matters, but stars are accessible. Finally, and this is probably most important of all, Generation Z do not diminish the value of their online relationships. And their online relationships overlap with their offline relationships. Generation Z are capable of having deep, enduring, meaningful friendships with people they've never met face-to-face, and they may never meet face-to-face. Relationships of this type have been possible for a long time, of course, but for many older generations, these types of relationships still somehow seem less legitimate. Oh, you have 800 friends on Facebook, but how many of them do you actually know? That seems like a perceptive question to a curmudgeonly old boomer, but to a Gen Z person, it hardly even makes sense as a question. Their answer will be, well, like you, I have best friends and close friends and just friends and distant friends and acquaintances, and I'm able to distinguish between them, and I'm able to have them all on Facebook. More to the point, their face-to-face friends will almost never be just face-to-face. Part of the ritual of becoming friends for them is exchanging socials. Gen Z members will meet up at the shops like teenagers always have, but then they'll be Snapchatting one another on the bus on the way home. The technology merely provides another layer of the relationship. All of this leads to the key question. How do we effectively teach the brains and the minds that have grown up under these circumstances? One answer, of course, is to say, well, we shouldn't change anything. Nobody was asking how Gen X brains differed from boomer brains or the brains of the great generation. Teaching was teaching. Teachers set the curriculum and students responded to those demands or they failed. Why change now? Well, I reject that approach out of hand. I turn up at university because I want to educate. I want students to be successful. I'm not a gatekeeper or an arbiter setting hurdles and then sitting back dispassionately while the students try to leap them. The best teachers have always been focused on student success. If we want to teach successfully, if we want to take the knowledge in our brains and our minds and transfer that knowledge to create understanding in the mind of the student, then we have to do it in a way that makes sense to the mind of the student. If we don't, well, methodologically great teaching might not actually be teaching much at all. So we have to meet Gen Z where they are and teach the way that they learn. Fortunately, we're not entirely without guidance. I'm convinced, indeed I'm devoted, to the principles known as the PEN principles, established by the Science of Learning Research Centre at the University of Queensland. They did something that in retrospect seems so obvious that it should have been done decades ago. They said, well, psychologists can tell us how minds work. Educators can tell us how learning works. Neuroscientists can tell us how brains work. Let's bring them together. Psychology, education, neuroscience, PEN. They developed a series of 12 principles. I'm not going to go through them one by one, but I will pull them into the rest of this presentation. For now, though, I want you to understand that much of what I do is applying the genius of these principles. Much of the credit is not mine. So then how do we teach? First up, we must understand that Generation Z are the greatest skimmers the world has ever seen. When it comes to information, they are used to drinking from a fire hydrant. I refer to them as the great curators. They are presented with multiple, never-ending, literally never-ending feeds of information. If they tried to take it all in, they would go nuts. This is so for any social media user, but remember, Gen Z have never known anything else. For each item in the stream, they immediately judge. Do I ignore this? Is reading the heading enough? Do I react? Do I engage more deeply? For educators, this means that any information we present to these students in any form, through any media, will have to pass through that screen. This applies PEN Principle 10 that first impressions colour future judgment. When I was an undergraduate, material was presented to me and I learned it because it had been presented to me. That doesn't work now. Now, some of you will be saying, well, if they get presented information and they curate it away instead of paying attention, then they get poor marks. They've only got themselves to blame. Well, that's not true. Students now know that there are dozens and dozens of alternative ways for them to cover material. I have lost count of the number of students who've come onto my YouTube channel and said things like, I really couldn't understand Estoppel when my lecturer explained it, but this video makes it clear. Now, I'm not saying that to boast. I'm saying it to show that these students have been unsatisfied with what they've been presented with in class, and they've gone looking online for alternatives. When I was an undergraduate in the 1990s, this was still possible. In Brisbane, I could have ditched my lectures at UQ and sneaked into the equivalent lectures at QUT or Griffith. I could have engaged a private tutor. I could have read non-prescribed textbooks. That's about it, though. For current students, alternatives, thousands of alternatives, are just a Google away. So if I want to be the one teaching them in my classroom, then my material has to be worth clicking on, or they will go elsewhere and my work is pointless. So that's point one. We have to convince the students that we're worth clicking on. Second, these students have always been presented with information in the context of images. Big blocks of text like this one, which have been a simple reality for law students forever, well, these are completely counterintuitive for Gen Z students. Facebook posts with photos receive almost 40% more engagement. TikTok and Snap stories won't let you post simple text at all. So to be effective, we need to present words and pictures together. This aligns with PEN Principle 2, that visual images and spoken word mix well. Why? Well, the part of the brain that processes language, whether written or spoken, is different to the part of the brain that processes images. If you present two lots of words like I'm doing right now, by presenting written words on the screen and spoken words over the top, you put all the processing load on the one part of the brain. The brain divides its resources to tackle both tasks, and it does neither well. However, if you present words and images, one part of the brain handles the words and another part of the brain handles the images, and then they magically link. Students might struggle to remember a concept, but then the image might come to mind, and suddenly the concept will be there. We're all familiar with this. We've all been in the situation where we're talking about someone and we're struggling to place them. Or we meet someone and we're struggling to place them. We can see their face, we can see the image, and suddenly their name appears. Or someone says the name and we see the image. If we don't use images as educators and use them well, then we're only activating one of the processing centres that can help students to learn. This idea upsets some educational purists who have to learn that their wordy 1997 PowerPoint slides are suboptimal, even if they've discovered how to animate them. I've personally been told, this is law school. We don't do picture books. To that I say, I'll do whatever best helps students to learn. So these first two principles, that teaching needs to be worth clicking on and words need to be accompanied by images, they overlap. They overlap to say that we need to combine education and entertainment. In one sense, the best teachers have always known this. The best teachers have always known that students learn best when they're having fun. But think about the best teaching that you've ever seen. Here's the start of the best teaching that I've ever seen.
The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Our contemplations of the cosmos stir us. There's a tingling in the spine, a catch in the voice, a faint sensation as if a distant memory of falling from a great height. We know we are approaching the grandest of mysteries. The size and age of the cosmos are beyond ordinary human understanding. Lost somewhere between immensity and eternity is our tiny planetary home, the Earth. For the first time, we have the power to decide the fate of our planet and ourselves. This is a time of great danger, but our species is young and curious and brave. It shows much promise. In the last few millennia, we have made the most astonishing and unexpected discoveries about the cosmos and our place within it. I believe our future depends powerfully on how well we understand this cosmos in which we float like a mote of dust in the morning sky. We're about to begin a journey through the cosmos. We'll encounter galaxies and suns and planets, life and consciousness, coming into being, evolving, and perishing. Worlds of ice and stars of diamond, atoms as massive as suns, and universes smaller than atoms. But it's also a story of our own planet and the plants and animals that share it with us. And it's a story about us, how we achieved our present understanding of the cosmos, how the cosmos has shaped our evolution and our culture, and what our fate may be.
Think about it. Someone in the late 1970s said to the renowned cosmologist Carl Sagan, "We want you to teach normal people some of the most complicated scientific principles in existence. We want you to teach them how the universe began, how light works, how time works. We want you to show them everything from the principles of tiny subatomic particles through to how galaxies work." And he did, because he made it entertaining. It's still one of the best documentary series ever produced. In the modern world, the online, mobile, YouTube, TikTok world, good teachers need to develop the skills of a documentary maker. Sagan, who was a university academic, understood this 40 years ago, before the internet was even a dream. Some of my first videos look really strange to me now because they look like what they are. They're cheap, nasty videos knocked together in my study at home. I've learned a lot more now, but much of what I've learned has been learning of my own ignorance, my ignorance at graphic design, at video editing, at script writing. It turns out these may be core skills for law schools in the next 3/4 of the 21st century. But I guarantee that not a single law school in Australia has a graphic designer or a camera operator on staff. So that's the third principle. Education is edutainment. The days of giving students slabs of text and just saying, read until your eyeballs bleed, those days are over. They won't do that. The students will already come on my YouTube channel and I will teach them instead. That's already happening. So far, we know that we have to be clickable. We know we have to use images. We know we have to entertain. All of that leads to the next one. Lecturers cannot be remote. I remember in roughly 1992, I took a political science subject taught by the late but brilliant Professor Colin Hughes. Hughes had been academic royalty in Queensland since the 1960s. Lecturers in those days had 1 hour a week posted as their consultation hour when students could just drop in. Most academics sat in their office alone for that hour. One day I dropped in on Hughes because I'd missed a lecture and I wanted to ask for the notes. I didn't get them because he didn't use notes, but I was startled when he recognised my name. I didn't expect that. Lecturers were these people who walked into the theatre, declaimed from the front, and then walked out. That was lecturing. Even now in normal life, if you say that you're lecturing someone, it means that you're talking from on high without listening. It's one-way traffic. Lecturers back in the day were remote figures called professor or doctor. That's not going to cut it anymore. Students who can ask Taylor Swift to the prom are not going to accept remote teachers. When I write scripts for lectures or for any of my videos or for tonight's presentation, I deliberately adopt the tone that I would adopt if we were sitting around in a wine bar or a coffee shop and I was the slightly more knowledgeable person in the group of friends talking about the law. It sounds weird to me if a student calls me doctor. Students know that LinkedIn is professional in the way that Instagram is personal. And so dozens of students immediately connect with me on LinkedIn at the start of the term. They expect me to be accessible and they expect me to teach them collaboratively, not hierarchically. This fits in with the principles I've already mentioned. It's hard to entertain if you're preaching. If you're not collaborative, if you're too remote, you're less clickable. Of course, this creates problems when lecturers flip around and become examiners. Our usual model is that I teach students and then I mark their work. The dynamic between a learner and their collaborative teacher is completely different to the dynamic between a learner and their examiner. The examiner dynamic is actually toxic to the collaborative dynamic. A student who's just received a disappointing grade from me, they see me as less clickable, less entertaining, less approachable. In my view, if we were taking this approach to education seriously, we would separate the roles. I should assess someone else's students and they should assess mine. So we have to be clickable, we have to use images, we have to entertain, and we cannot be remote. The next one is perhaps the most controversial of all the propositions that I bring with me today, and that is that students backchannel, and this should be encouraged. Let me explain. As a card-carrying Gen Xer, I used to get really irritated when I'd look out into the lecture theatre and see students on their phones. I thought, you're killing me here, guys. Then I thought, well, maybe I'm just not clickable enough. I tried to improve my lecturing technique. No effect, not even a little bit. I then learned that students backchannel. What I mean by this is that there are often Facebook groups for subjects and smaller Facebook Messenger groups among friends in the students group. And students can be simultaneously listening to the lecture, taking notes, opening case law databases on their phones to bookmark the cases that I mentioned, and chatting to their friends to say, did anyone understand that last bit? Because I didn't get it. To me, it looked like rudeness. What was actually happening, though, was collaborative learning, as performed by a generation which does not distinguish between online and offline relationships. From the perspective of the PEN principles, this back-channeling is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, Principle 6 says that multitasking impairs memory and learning. On the other hand, Principle 9 tells us that active recall trumps passive review. Active learning is often collaborative. The back-channeling is going to happen. The challenge is to adapt to it and incorporate it in circumstances where the lecturer can never be part of it. Because if I'm part of the conversation, it's no longer back-channeling. I'm not fooled, though. I know that many times when students pick up their phones, it is because I'm being curated out. And in fact, they are chatting with their boyfriend or clicking like on some celeb's latest outfit. However, students have talked in class or doodled on their notebooks for as long as there have been students. And I've never yet found myself in the position of my colleague Zara Bending from Macquarie Uni, who realised that two of her students were surreptitiously engaging in a far too intimate moment in the middle of her lecture. She handled the situation much better than I would have. I want to put forward just one more proposition. In doing so, however, I'm very aware that this may be something that law schools do worst of all. Schools, secondary schools, certainly do this better than us. I suspect that many other university disciplines also do this better than us, but everyone needs to do better. The principle is students need to be able to fail. PEN Principle 8 says embrace error to improve learning. I want to give you two examples. First, I'm going to start with Dave Grohl. For those of you who don't know Dave Grohl, he has three amazing achievements. First, he was the drummer for the band Nirvana during their most successful years. Second, he founded the colossal band, the Foo Fighters. Third, and perhaps most impressively of all, he once defeated Animal from the Muppets in a drum battle. Watch this.
Waiting years for this animal.
Now we see who best.
Oh, what's that? A bell? Time for school.
Oh, yeah?
You win. Waiting.
Dave Grohl was asked about what it takes to make a great musician. Now, I'm going to remove the worst of the obscenities from his answer, but what he said was musicians should go to a yard sale and buy an old drum set and get in their garage and just suck and get their friends to come in and they'll suck too. And then they'll start playing and they'll have the best time they ever had in their lives. And then all of a sudden they'll become Nirvana, because that's exactly what happened with Nirvana. Just a bunch of guys that had some crappy old instruments and they got together and started playing some noisy ass stuff and they became the biggest band in the world. It could almost be an educational anthem. Suck until you succeed. Moving on from Grohl, the largest language education organisation in the world today is a phone app called Duolingo. It has millions of users studying dozens of languages. As the app reminds me at least once a week, there are more people studying Duolingo than studying languages in US public schools. There are more people studying Irish on Duolingo than there are actual native Irish speakers. And how does Duolingo work? There are no lessons. No lessons. You get on, and from the first moment, it sets you little tests. And initially, you fail them. Soon, though, you don't. And as you progress, everything remains a balance between repeated failure and repeated success. It's brilliant. A 2-hour lecture and a 1-hour tute where most students remain silent doesn't cut it. In many cases, the first chance that our students get to fail is when they're sitting a final assessment that counts for grades. Failure is a teaching tool, not just an assessment tool. The best students need to fail. They just need to fail at more complex stuff than the weaker students. Okay, this is really appealing to Gen X now because only Gen Xers remember the young ones. But recently, I suggested that the university should take some vacant space and turn it into a game show studio. The suggestion wasn't taken seriously, but I'm completely in earnest. Students could take part in a game show based on their degree. Doesn't matter if they study law, geology, marine biology, the principle is the same. They get the chance to go into that studio and be wrong. And others playing along when they watch on YouTube, they get the chance to be wrong as well. And sad though it is, that may teach students better than I do. So where does this leave us all? First, we have to accept that Gen Z minds are different, utterly different. If we want to fill those minds with knowledge, we have to do it their way. How's that? Well, we have to be clickable, or the great curators will just scroll past us. We have to present material with images to engage multiple processing centres in the brain. We have to entertain to channel our inner Carl Sagan. As educators, we need to be approachable and collegiate, neither demanding nor expecting deference. We need to accept that students will use back channels, and we need to take advantage of that. And finally, we need to ensure that students have chance after chance after chance to fail without it appearing on their transcript. What does that look like in the classroom? Well, first and foremost, the days when the 2-hour face-to-face lecture could be the primary method of tertiary teaching, those days are well and truly gone. This does not mean there is no longer a place for face-to-face teaching, far from it. But the primary method of delivery of material to students must be through electronic means that simulate, as far as possible, the best aspects of the classroom experience, but which are also accessible to students in bite-sized chunks that they can view at any time, anywhere. It looks something like this.
G'day everyone, and welcome to the second video in week 1 of our Legal Ethics and Trust Accounting course. In the first video this week, we looked at what it means to say that the law is a profession. We looked in particular at the fact that being a profession means submitting to professional discipline and having and adhering to professional ethics. In this second video, we're going to ask what exactly we mean by ethics. I mean, ethics is a word that we've all heard many times in our lives, but it might well be that you've never actually stopped to think about what the word actually means. At its simplest, ethics refers to the question of how a person ought to behave. Ethics asks about people's character and their morality. It asks what it means to be a good person, and it asks why we would want to be a good person anyway. The study of ethics, which was also historically called the study of moral philosophy, goes back thousands of years. One of the earliest serious works we have is by the philosopher Aristotle, who wrote a book called the Nicomachean Ethics, where he proposed that the way to happiness and a good life was through being a person of virtue, a person of excellent character.
The videos can't just be a recording of a lecture. They can't just be a voiceover of a lecturer speaking over PowerPoint slides. They need to be scripted, graphically active. Something needs to happen on screen every 60 seconds. And it needs to be supported by pedagogical theory, either the PEN principles or something else. Next, those materials have to be supplemented by face-to-face teaching, where the emphasis is not on presenting the fundamental material because the students have already received that in the videos. The focus of face-to-face teaching needs to be the practical application of the materials and Socratic discussion about the materials. In order to make these face-to-face sessions more entertaining and in a sense more clickable, I've done away in my classroom with old-fashioned tutorial questions in favour of bespoke animations, which become the basis of our discussions. An example looks like this.
Benderman, welcome. It's always good to see you.
Hey, it's good to see you too, man. Well, not really so good. I mean, everyone likes to have a good lawyer, but nobody wants to actually need a good lawyer, right?
You mean you're not here to offer me a place on your band, man?
Yeah, unfortunately, we only use actual guitarists, man. Air guitar doesn't count.
Ah well. If you ever change your mind, you know where I am. So listen. How did the release go for the new single?
Yeah, not too bad. The time was a bit unfortunate. There's a band called Bar None that released their single on the same day as us. A pub rock band from Wagga. They're really good. I think they took some of the spotlight away from us.
I've heard about them. I also heard they are pretty good. People should check them out.
Are you really allowed to put little commercials like that into these videos, man?
Ask Marnak. I'm just an animated character.
Check out Bar None on Spotify. Now, let's get on with the ethics scenario, shall we?
Did you sort out the copyright infringement issue yet?
No. The anonymous Pikellets still say we stole the chord progression from their song. It's crap, man. I wrote that chord progression myself. In the bathtub.
Don't go visual. Don't go visual.
Look, the copyright issue is actually why I'm here. That advice you wrote for us was awesome. I was really pleased with how well you explained everything. You explained how mere similarity between two pieces of music isn't enough. I really think that if the other side read that advice, they would just back down.
Benderman, that advice was written for you, not for them.
I know, man. And I want them to see it.
I really think you should think this through.
Send it, man. And maybe I will let you play on our next track.
I should have become a landscape designer.
These discussions give students opportunities to be wrong, but not enough opportunities. We need to innovate creatively to change what our face-to-face sessions look like, to make them worth coming onto campus for, or the students will not. It's fairly common for people to mock younger generations, but this generation, Gen Z, is potentially a groundbreakingly brilliant generation. They dealt with COVID, taking on the most harmful consequences of lockdowns during the most important years of their schooling. They lost their casual jobs. They got out, they kept at it. They are resilient, independent, fully integrated with our technological environment, and they want us to teach them. We need to be up to the task. Kerry, I'm very happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Anthony. Well, you certainly have created some controversial statements in your presentation. Thank you very much. And I'm going to go now to the Q&A questions that are up there. And I'll start with the first one. And this was referring to how does accessibility work in high schools where strict distancing rules apply and teachers have to be separate from the students. So what kind of advice or response would you do there?
I think there is a difference between the university teaching environment and the secondary teaching environment, partly because everyone that I teach is an adult. Everyone that I teach, nobody that I teach is a person within my care. in the sense that a school student is a young person who's within the care of a high school teacher. And so that creates opportunities for me to be more collaborative and less hierarchical than is possible in a schooling environment. The second thing is that I'm not responsible for anyone's behaviour. I don't have the disciplinary aspect, the classroom management aspect that a lot of teachers have to deal with. And so the environment's very difficult. So look, I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that the observations that I'm making about teaching in a tertiary environment to young adults who have made that kind of transition of having a horrible week at schoolies and then coming out the other end and going to university, I wouldn't want to be seen to be suggesting that all of the strategies that I've identified as things that we need to work on at a tertiary level, that they're necessarily applicable to secondary schooling. I think some of the themes are applicable, but they're very different teaching environments. And frankly, I have nothing but admiration for secondary school teachers. I think if I was doing their job, I would be in either prison or mental health care within a week.
Well, but what we have noticed with students coming into JCU from schools, where schools now have far more active learning strategies in place, and students are less likely to want to sit in a lecture in a passive learning environment, and hence your classrooms really do engage the students and situate the learning in the student space. Another question that has been posed, and that is, how do we deliver heaps of technical contents in multimedia? Hold on a moment, I just missed it. In that multimedia format. And is it achievable to convert a content full book full of technical contents or complex to a picture book? So basically referring to how do we transition from a content specific text into an interactive digital learning object?
I think there's always, if you look at traditional university teaching, there is already a distinction between the way that lectures work and deliver information, and then the way that tutorials work and deliver information, and then the way that a prescribed textbook delivers that same information. And so that type of scaffolding is already there. What I would suggest we're trying to do is take the lecture and turn that into a series of multimedia videos. That's somewhat different from taking the textbook and turning that into a series of multimedia videos, because the textbook, I believe textbooks are still going to be part of the atmosphere, part of the environment for students, but more as a point of reference. So, okay, I've watched the 3 or 4 videos for this week, and there's an area of this that the lecturer has identified as something that I should look into in more detail, or it's something that I've struggled to understand, or it's something that I'm interested in and want to know more about. And then they will go straight to the textbook, identify the bit of the textbook that refers to that, and use that to deepen knowledge. It is hard work to take a lecture course as traditionally delivered and turn that into active, well graphically supported, well pictorially supported videos. I'm not saying this stuff is easy. I'm just saying it's worth it.
Yes, and that's also one of the challenges that educators are now facing, where previously the focus was being an expert in your discipline, and now educators are expected to also be multimedia graphic designers, producers of digital learning objects. So it certainly has created a huge gap in the educators who are able to prepare the materials such as what you have provided, and those of us who still have a lot of catching up to do.
Well, it also means, Kerry, that lecturing staff have to constantly see themselves as content creators. That it's perfectly possible in a 1980s or 1990s classroom It's perfectly possible to have one set of lecturing notes that you use for 7 or 8 years, and once they're written, they just have to be delivered for 2 hours once a year for each set of lecturing notes. I think that those days are gone now. And if we're going to deliver high quality education at a tertiary level, academics need to see themselves almost as daily content creators. One of the things that I'm toying with, because I think I may be too old for it, but one of the things I'm toying with is whether I should be using TikTok so that I can get 30 to 60 seconds in front of students every day to say, here's what I'd like you to be doing today. Here's something I'd like, here's an interesting fact about this week's material that you might have picked up on. It is asking a lot, and it's asking academics to change ways that have been delivered perfectly well for a long time. I don't underestimate the size of the challenge. Again, I just think it's worth it.
Yeah, thank you. And it certainly is what you have presented this evening and what you've been speaking about is that we as educators have to step into that student space, that we have to know our student, that there are those blurred lines in regards to accessibility between the lecturer and the student. One of the questions also is, how have your students responded to this?
In one sense, I wish I had some students here to answer that question for me. The feedback that I get is very positive. The students do seem to get something out of it, but I guess the best way to answer that is to say that there are 19 or 20,000 students from other universities and other places around the world who are coming and been voluntarily watching my stuff. I mean, I've heard within the last week academics saying we can't get students come into the classrooms. Well, I'm getting 1,000 views a day from people who don't have to look at my stuff at all. So I really think that there is a hunger there, and the students appreciate it, but it's not just the technology. I wouldn't want you to think that I see some sort of magic technological answer to this. It's technology on top of 2 other things. One is that the fundamental scholarship has to be there. You have to actually have proper, well-researched, well-understood stuff that you're an expert in order to teach it to the students, or you may as well not start. And the third thing is you have to be invested in student success. You can't fake that with the students. The students know whether you want them to succeed or not. If you want students to succeed and you put in a bunch of effort into doing that, whether it's animations or puppet shows, for all I care, if you put in solid effort because you want students to succeed, they get that. They totally get it, and you can't fake it.
Yes. Okay. We actually have some of your students in this evening, and one of the comments from one of our student is that what of your thoughts of having some type of mandatory course for all lecturers and teaching staff regarding how to teach young minds, and why is it important?
I think that lecturers are typically allergic to the word mandatory. I think that what I would say is that hundreds of different industries in all parts of the economy have had to fundamentally change because technology has come along and changed the way they operate. And there are brilliant teachers in this university, in other universities, who don't have the particular skill set that I've got to deliver this material. And whether they are encouraged to develop that skill set, or whether those skills are brought in support of them in order to deliver the material, I think that one way or another, active learning of this type is not going away. And so we need to be looking for ways to capture the brilliance of excellent teachers that we've got now and deliver that in a way that's going to work for the current and then the next generation of students.
Thank you. And that also addresses some of the questions that are coming through regarding how can we assist lecturers to move to this method of teaching. It needs to have a whole of institute approach where the professional development is available, but also the teams are supported by digital technologists and educational technologists to make that happen. One of the other questions,
but also lots of, there needs to be dialogue with the students about this. The reason that I had do the animations every week now is because the students like them and told me they wanted more of them. Lots of times in the animations, I absolutely take the mick out of myself as a character in the animations, and the students like that. And the more forthright students will straight up tell me which bits they like and which bits they don't. And I try to listen more to the bits they don't like, because the bits they do like just give you an ego boost, and that's great. But the more dialogue we have with the actual students, the better this is going to go. Because I don't know what the next big social media thing is going to be, but the students do, and they'll pick it up 6 months before I will. And so if I'm the salt and pepper haired man standing at the front of the classroom, I won't get that. But if I'm engaging with the students and communicating with them, then all of a sudden I'll know I need to switch away from having a focus on YouTube and start focusing more on Snap Stories, because we need to go where they are.
Okay, thank you. And look, we've got lots of questions coming through that we won't be able to get to all of them, but there's one here that that I think we do need to address, and that was, how might you approach student agency with failure and motivation from a pedagogical stance? So that was really quite a controversial statement that you made in regards to embracing error. How would you support that, or how might you approach it?
There's going to be a process. If that approach to education was taken, there would need to be a transition period, because at the moment students are terrified of failure. Students see that failing one assignment or performing poorly on one assignment is going to have outsized impacts on their future. And you can't learn from failure if you're terrified of it. And so providing safe opportunities to fail, and then emphasising that we see failure as a teaching tool, that we see failure as a part of progress. I mean, I can't imagine how many times Roger Federer would have missed a serve before he got to the point where he was Roger Federer. You know, I can't imagine how many millions of serves Roger Federer has missed whilst training to play tennis. And yet we certainly don't think of him as a failure on the tennis court. In baseball, the greatest baseball batters hit the ball one time in 3, and the other 2 times they fail, they get struck out. There are plenty of examples in society where we understand that failure is the preparation for further success. And that's something that culturally we don't quite have in universities. Cultures are terribly difficult to change. And so I don't underestimate the difficulty of that. But I think it's more actually the fear of the consequences of failure that we need to deal with, as opposed to the concept of failure itself.
Okay, so we've also got a number of law lecturers in this evening's presentation, and one of the questions here is that how would these concepts apply in preparing students for working in law, for example, with judges, clients, other lawyers, and for example, it's not about to start keeping their talk to 120 seconds or using images. So shouldn't we be preparing students for non-clickable interaction in the real world or in the professional legal sphere?
There's 2 aspects to that. There's the side of legal education that teaches students the law. And then there's the side of legal education that teaches students how to be lawyers. And there's a bunch of stuff that is inescapable in the law. The law is made of words. The law will always involve dealing with great big blocks of words. A contract is never going to not have boilerplate, and you need to be able to concentrate and see your way through it and understand it. And for those sorts of practical sides of lawyering, how to write an affidavit, there is no escape from that. There is no escape from the fact that that is going to be required. But in the first place, when I'm teaching students the rules of evidence that they need to understand before they can write an affidavit, there's no reason that I can't make that easier. So none of this is a panacea. There's no such thing as a magic wand. But there are bits of the process where this can be really useful, so that I'm teaching students principles of contracts by using this sort of method. And then when they're more advanced, they learn how to write a contract. And that means sitting in front of a computer until their fingers go numb. And there's no escaping that. But that doesn't mean the whole process has to be that way.
Okay, so thank you. Look, I'm just going to go to one last question, and we have reached 7 o'clock, and I don't want to go over too much, but I felt this was important to make mention of. So, how do you manage a class that has Boomers, Gen Y, Gen X, Gen Z all together?
That's always going to be complicated, but it's no more complicated than managing a class of students who are differentiated in other ways. We have first in family students to university who are having a different experience to students who have a strong family history. We have students from different cultural backgrounds, students from different economic backgrounds. But what I find, though, is that the more interactive that the classes are, the more students start to bond together as a learning unit, regardless of whether they're Boomers, X's, or whatever. And the more that you start to get sharing across those different groups. And to me, part of the joy of university, part of the joy of being on campus is that even if you come from a culturally homogenous background, you come to university and you're going to deal with older people, you're going to deal with younger people, you're going to deal with gay folks, with trans folks, with folks from different races, different cultural backgrounds. That's the joy of university. And I wouldn't want to get rid of an inch of that diversity. It does sometimes make it hard, but that's not an excuse for not doing our best.
Okay, yeah, certainly. Thank you. That brings us to the end of the presentation. I would like to say a huge thank you, and please join me in thanking Anthony for such a engaging, challenging, controversial, and exciting presentation. I think that there is so much to reflect on and to consider in this space. There are a number of questions that we weren't able to answer this evening, but we will do our best to get that out to Anthony, and I'm sure Anthony won't mind responding to them via email.
I'd love to. One that's come up about 8 times is people want to know the animation software. It's called Plotagon. Okay, Plotagon. Plotagon. It's great. I love it.
Excellent. Thank you. And so just to conclude, thank you to the participants as well for coming in this evening and for being so engaging in the Q&A session as well. We ask that if you could please complete the post survey tonight, the link that's going to come up tonight in your browser. We'd really appreciate some feedback on this, and I know Anthony would as well. We've got some upcoming webinars, one in June on lifelong learning, real stories from the mature student experience, and on 21st of July, we've got JCU Careers in Health. Again, thank you very much for your participation, and Anthony, it has been a pleasure listening to you this evening. Thank you all very, very much.
Thanks, Karen.